initiative was started last year at the Carr Center with the hope of building an inclusive dialogue around Kashmir. The hope is not to sit here in Cambridge and hammer out some solutions for people living in Srinagar or Muzaffarabad, but much rather to understand the various nuances of the Kashmiri conflict, the stakeholders involved, who's at the table, who's not, what would a just and durable peace look like. So we're using our relative security and our stability of being at Harvard and our privilege of being able to bring in speakers, thinkers, writers, artists, photojournalists, and Kashmiris, non-Kashmiris, Indians, Pakistanis together to discuss various aspects of this conflict that has festered for 62 years. We hope after this panel today, and our panel is entitled Two Kashmirs, the Present Realities of Indian and Pakistani Administered Kashmir. We really hope you'll engage with the panelists and also join us for a reception at the Carr Center right afterwards. We're really glad today to have Dr. Suvir Kaul moderating our panel. Dr. Kaul is the Rosenthal Professor of English at University of Pennsylvania as well as the department chair. He is also on the advisory committee of the South Asia Center. His focus is on 18th century British literature as well as contemporary South Asian writing in English. And he has both a deep personal connection with Kashmir as well as a great, I just learned about his poetry project and other ideas he has for working and continuing his strong connection with Indian administered Kashmir. On our panel today we have Dr. Ahmad Faruqui from San Francisco, California, and Robert Nickelsberg from New York City. Our third panelist, Parvez Imroz, who's a human rights lawyer in Srinagar, is unfortunately not able to travel and join us today. Parvez has sent an audio recording of the presentation he wanted to make, the truncated presentation, and we will be getting to that later in the panel. I do want to thank today Carr Center Manager of Advocacy and Outreach, Stephen Brzozowski, who made this panel possible and has shown a great interest in the Kashmir Initiative, as well as may I welcome Charlie Clemons. Dr. Clemons started as the Executive Director of the Carr Center just yesterday and comes to us with a huge background in human rights work. He has been, most recently been the president of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, and in the past has also served as the president of Physicians for Human Rights, and worked on a range of human rights issues from water rights to a ban on landmines, so we're really excited to have him today. But with that, I want to pass it on to our faculty director, Rory Stewart, who those of you who have been following UK and US News know Rory is engaged in has a wide range of interests, engagements, activities, but he's also currently the Ryan Professor in Practice of Human Rights here at Kennedy School. And with that, may I pass it on to Rory to welcome you all to the Carr Center. Thank you.
Well, I'm really here to say thank you all very much for coming, but a particular thanks to Malika who's put this together, which is a really impressive event and a real example of student leadership. This is a great group of people I can see in the room. I know, I suppose, about maybe 70% of you. Really hope this is going to be an exciting discussion. Those of you who were in the discussion last semester, you'll remember this can be a somewhat fiery topic. We very much welcome in the Carr Center disagreement, but we hope at least polite, reasoned disagreement with each other on what is a very contentious issue, and I think a great opportunity for us to discuss a contentious issue in a relatively, as Marcus said, safe and secure environment in which to express disagreements. It's a great privilege to have such a very distinguished panel with us here and to have such a variety of different presentations, from contributions on literature and politics through contributions on photography to Bez's contribution, sadly passportless, by an audio tape. And also to second Malika's statement of welcome to Charlie, who you can see in the blue shirt there, who's our new executive director. I'm going to have to step away very briefly, I'm afraid, because I have a faculty meeting. But I will come back and join you, I hope, towards the end again. And thank you all very much indeed. And I look forward to seeing what happens. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Malika too. She has been the human face of the planning and of the contact, and actually a human face only today. It's been an email face so far, and a very pleasant one at that. Thank you for making this happen. I'm going to do more than just moderate the panel. I'm going to spend a little time talking about what I take to be my sense of life on the ground in Indian administered Kashmir. And I'm going to begin by reminding us of a date, February 11, 1984. I'm willing to wager that almost nobody in India, or indeed in this audience, almost nobody, because I'm sure there are a few people who recognize the significance of this date, thinks of this date as being of particular significance. They certainly do not think of it as a date momentous enough to observe annually. However, Srinagar and large parts of the Kashmir Valley were shut down entirely this year, both in response to a call for a strike given by the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, endorsed by both the factions of the Hurriyat Conference, and because the government, fearing mass demonstrations, had imposed curfew-like restrictions, which included the arrests of several JKLF leaders. On this day in 1984, Muhammad Maqbool Bhatt, one of the founders of the JK National Liberation Front, was hanged in Delhi after being convicted of murder and his body buried in Tihar jail there. Then, as now, many Kashmiris believe that Bhatt's execution, years after he was first sentenced, came in swift retaliation for the kidnapping and murder a few days earlier of an Indian diplomat, Ravindra Mahatre, in Birmingham. Feb 11 has since then entered the political calendar of many Kashmiris, and Bhatt himself has joined the martyrology of the independence movement. There are many such anniversaries now that are marked in Srinagar and in several of the district towns of the Kashmir Valley, each a reminder of histories that have diverged as a result of political movements from those that the Indian state tells as its own. But not only the Indian state, and this is my point here. There is little consensus about the history of movements of self-determination even amongst Kashmiris. And here I am talking of Kashmiri Muslims, for there are only a handful of non-Muslim Kashmiris who are willing to speak the language of self-determination. As you can imagine, different political groupings lay claim to different narratives and different heroes, and not all of them are interested in self-determination or independence or even amalgamation with Pakistan. There are many political groups active in the Kashmir Valley and throughout the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, and of course there are powerful statewide parties like the National Conference and the People's Democratic Party who seek to function under the aegis of the Indian Constitution as long as the functional autonomy granted to Jammu and Kashmir by Article 370 is respected. There is an elected government now in place. I should note, however, that elections in this state are never entirely free and fair and have on more than one occasion been massively rigged or conducted coercively, and they and the parties now in opposition in the state legislature constitute a very large political commitment to an Indian Kashmir. However, as these politicians, that is the politicians who speak on behalf of Indian constitutionalism, and more importantly, the hundreds of thousands of Kashmiris who vote for them will tell you, Kashmir has not been a functioning democracy or civil society for over 2 decades now. I refer particularly to the aftermath of the armed conflict and mass protests that broke out in December 1989, but it is arguably the case that Kashmir's elections, and particularly the fraudulent elections of 1987, were always manipulated to suppress political groups opposed to Indian control. Since 1990, when the Armed Forces Special Powers Act was enforced, civil authority has been largely limited by the overwhelming militarized platoons directly controlled by the central Indian government, of which the Army, the Rashtriya Rifles, the Border Security Force, the Central Reserve Police Force are the most visible. The Jammu and Kashmir State Police works for the most part at the behest of these powerful entities. Worse, and this is a development that has caused grievous harm to ordinary Kashmiris, the police response to insurgency has been to create their own paralegal counterinsurgency force, the Special Operations Group, which often recruits from turned militants and is notorious for the brutality of its operations. This has been life on the ground for 2 decades. People in villages hemmed in by army or paramilitary encampments and patrols, often forcibly alienated from the farms and orchards they have cultivated, fearful of the men in uniform who surround them. Similarly, People in towns and cities are kept in check by bunkers at street corners and heavily armed soldiers deployed along major streets, with crackdowns, that's the term that is used, has been for a long time, and intrusive surveillance, the order of the day. State power is militarized, visible, and quick to strike. But agents of the state are not the only killers of Kashmiris. In these same years, and now we encounter the problem of nomenclature, freedom fighters, insurgents, militants, take your pick, have killed and been killed in the pursuit of their political and ideological mission. Young men who trained at home, in Pakistan or elsewhere to battle the Indian state have died in large numbers, as have the non-Kashmiris who joined them. Conflict produces casualties amongst the combatants, of course, but the greater casualties have been borne, as always, by the civilian population, whether they be sympathizers of those who fight, or people caught in crossfires or bombings, or people killed because they just happened to be at the wrong time and in the wrong place. But perhaps my formulation is incorrect, because in polarized spaces like Kashmir, few are killed randomly. Those who are tortured or killed serve a purpose and are bearers of an ugly message. If you are not with us, you are against us. In the last few years, because of a number of international and internal pressures, which we can talk about later if you would like, fewer people commit to these skirmishes, these armed skirmishes, and fewer die. But this war of attrition is far from over. I should mention, though, that given the disproportionate power of state forces and the balance of power concerns that define Indo-Pakistani relations, I cannot see Kashmiri self-determination resulting from the actions of armed Tehrikis. None of what I've said so far will be of news to you. All of you, if you're in this room, are interested enough, I'm sure, in these issues to know these details. I, of course, have not spoken yet of the many contested, divisive issues that would come to the forefront if, and that is a mighty if, self-determination becomes a democratic possibility. Self-determination for whom? All the people who live in the territories that comprise the state of Jammu and Kashmir, ruled by the erstwhile Maharajas? That will mean the areas of Kashmir now under Pakistani control, including sections of Gilgit and Baltistan, as well as the areas of Kashmir now under Indian control, including Jammu and Ladakh. And that is precisely what India or Pakistan will not countenance. For neither nation state will give up on the territories they apportion between themselves. Even at its most utopian, and movements for self-determination must imagine futures whose contours seem impossible in the present, the idea of a unified and independent Kashmir runs up both against the problem of hyper-policed national borders, but also against the sometimes even deeper divisions that have been created by the political processes that have shaped modern Kashmir. Autocratic rule, as practiced by the Maharajas with the approval of their British overlords, and then as encouraged by independent India and Pakistan, have depended upon the generation, in some cases, the exacerbation of linguistic, ethnic and religious divides. For the votaries of Kashmiri self-determination then, the big question is, what model of independence, of an imagined collective future, will bring together people from Baltistan and Mirpur and Ladakh and Kishtwar and Jammu and Kashmir? You will have noticed, I'm sure, that my list derives from geographical provinces and thus avoids the further complications posed by ethnic and religious differences. Now I want to turn to an enormous economic and political irony operating in Indian Kashmir. For all the fact that hundreds of thousands of Kashmiris turn out for anti-India rallies, and no one has a good word to say for the army, the paramilitaries or the police, and most people are deeply cynical about and distrustful of civilian authorities, there are also enormous sections of the population, and I must emphasize this, enormous sections of the population who have benefited from the unrest of the last 20 years. I'm not speaking only of those for whom the state has been an illicit or licit paymaster, but of very large groups of people whose finances and domestic economies have visibly thrived. Srinagar is a boom town with stores whose marble and glass interiors rival those of shopping centers in Delhi. Huge bungalows have come up everywhere as paddy fields have been converted into housing estates. I don't know if how many of you have driven from Srinagar airport into the heart of Srinagar city. There are no paddy fields visible anymore, which 20 years ago you had miles and miles of paddy fields. It's all housing estates. And when I mean housing estates, I don't mean small condo units, I mean individual bungalows that are truly enormous and a sign of visible wealth. And such prosperity is not limited to the very rich. A drive out of Srinagar shows even modest homes with new or recently installed corrugated iron roofs, which is a feature of common homes that cannot be matched in most hill areas anywhere else in North India. I don't want even for a moment to suggest that there is not great poverty in the villages, or that basic infrastructure from electricity to roads to education and healthcare is not lacking. I do, however, want to emphasize the fact that a huge military presence and the concerted efforts of the central and state governments have expanded the economy of this conflict zone till it has created a great many people dependent on particular sources of revenue or employment. Not just the pro-India political parties, that is, but also entrepreneurs and businessmen and weavers and craftspeople and others who work in the tourist or provisions trades recognize the size of the market India makes available, and even as many of them hate Indian power, they have gained greatly from the Indian economy. In a situation like Kashmir, economic development, which is of course one of the foundations of state legitimacy, has long functioned as a counterweight to political processes. You are welcome to aspire to economic betterment, just so long as you do not let your political affiliation range beyond the options offered to you by India. On a micro level, the cynicism of such development is most evident in the way state funds are used, for instance, to turn insurgents, but also in the pointed ways in which they are used to wean local communities away from their political ambitions or desires. From what I can see, this has worked. Not completely and not permanently. But it has certainly resulted in a very large number of Kashmiris whose investments in the status quo lead them to believe that Kashmir's relation to India is less a historical and a political problem and more a civic and human rights issue. Kashmiris are not granted the rights made available to them by the Indian Constitution, and that is why daily life is fractured and fragile. And daily life is indeed deeply fractured and fragile. It is heartbreaking to consider the human costs of repression and of insurgency. Kashmiri life was changed forever when the largest numbers of Hindus left the valley. We should remember, though, that 4,000 still live there, as do some 50,000 Sikhs. And Kashmiriyat, that nostalgic name for a composite culture, is now a memory and an ideal. That absence is a jagged wound, and even when that wound scars over, it will mark a changed Kashmir. In Srinagar, no one I know has been exempt from violence. My friends who have grown up there have been at the receiving end of consistent humiliation, perhaps none worse than encountering Indians who believe that democracy prevails in Kashmir. So many dead. The circles of loss eddy outwards till images of weeping mothers and sisters, and we will see in Bob Nickelsberg's pictures some of these. The circles of loss eddy outwards till the images of weeping mothers and sisters and of families frenzied with grief define daily life. But this grief and anger has also galvanized people and politicized them. And the mothers of the disappeared have joined civil society groups, like the members of the Jammu and Kashmir Coalition of Civil Societies led by Parvez Imroz, to demand an accounting of all those who were killed and of those who continue killing. Young people are trying to revive or build for the first time civil institutions that will outlast these killing times, and which will produce cohorts of thinkers, educators, activists, whose efforts will, by engaging with the crisis of the present, demand a different future. None of this is easy, most such activities being largely unwelcome to those in power. And then 20 years later, there is the fatigue, the sheer absurdity, as a friend put it, of being a Kashmiri in Kashmir. These are the burdens and the challenges of being Kashmiri today. In this introduction, or this little talk, I have steered clear of historical details and chronologies of political events, but I'll be happy to speak of their importance later. My job has been to remind you of the complexity, difficulty, and possibility of lives in the part of Kashmir I know, and I now look forward to all that our panelists have to tell us, and also to the discussion after. Thank you.
Suvir and Malika for organizing everything. Can you
Just touch that screen, the projector just went to sleep. It's on the touch screen. It should just, you should be able just to wake up the projector. It just went to sleep probably.
The screen went to sleep too.
Just, okay, hold on.
You're right, got it.
Always.
It has to be a technical problem, otherwise it won't be an authentic panel here. Yeah.
Are both sides complaining?
Oh, both sides are always complaining. Because the point of view is there's so many factions, and I just think there's so many realities. And also you have to look at the generations. There's no true story because there's so many.
International Court of Justice in there.
You know, that's a very interesting question because actually the UN used to be very involved in Kashmir issues, but it is so highly politicized. And, you know, the person to ask is some deep experts. I said, I just want the reconstruction teams. So my perspective is very limited. And, you know, if you're going to get into the earthquake still, which was after 2005, it's still had a profound effect. Oh no, it's just terrible. Conditions are just like a lot of I mean, they've lost their schools and they've lost their hospitals.
No one.
The population, they're still suffering. They're still, most of the kids are still in 10 schools.
No, I
So the
did
two
not.
perspective I get is like the grassroots. You know, people are trying to build those back. I'm going to see a couple of them in Delhi actually.
Okay, a quick history of my time in South Asia, which began in 1988 when I moved to New Delhi with Time magazine, and we had 6 countries to cover: Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. The Soviets had just left.
Can you read off, or are you
No,
not reading?
I don't need to read.
Oh, lovely. Then this is good.
So the Soviets had left Afghanistan, in theory, and of course, like mushrooms, these conflicts just pop up again, and what was brewing after the 1987 elections in Kashmir, the fraud and the rigging, more or less coalesced with movement to organize and protest more forcefully, and this is in Untitled, in one of the mosques, where essentially the militancy started with trips across the border to be trained. And it's a lot to take in when you move to South Asia for a journalist, and the learning curve is still quite serious. But remember, this is back when paddy fields were still from the airport to Srinagar city. Telex was the mode of communication, if that worked. Movie theaters were sort of open, liquor shops were kind of open, and the migration of the pundits had not begun. But this was now quite serious, and to have stepped into this as a journalist, really, there was a lot going on across the border, then again across the border in Afghanistan, which was affecting the movement inside Kashmir, and everyone felt that with the large army kicked out of Afghanistan, maybe they could kick the Indian Army out of Kashmir. So this is the beginning here. This slideshow, 50 slides, will go across to Azad Kashmir, up into Khost, Afghanistan, back to outside of Peshawar, again into Siachen Glacier on the Pakistan side, and then back over into Indian-held side. So the slides jump all around. Now these are, we were taken on a trip from Muzaffarabad on the Azad Kashmir side to what had appeared to be victims of Indian shelling on the Pakistan side, Gujjar community, refugees who had been forced across the border to take sanctuary from the shelling, which was a regular occurrence back in the late 80s and most of the 90s. So the military, the inter-service public relations people had gathered a bunch of journalists in buses to take us to visit these refugees, what we call a dog and pony show. And the driver got lost, and we ended up in a camp full of Kashmiri militants. And this is not what they had taken us to see, because remember, this is moral, political support that they're showing for the Kashmir movement, but not material support. So these people obviously look well-fed, well taken care of, and not refugees who have been involved in shelling. So quickly we were surrounded by this for, freedom, we want freedom slogans, and TV cameras were rolling, and Voice of America and everybody, BBC were, really we stepped in something quite interesting. So the senior officer berated the driver, and we were herded back onto our bus and taken to where we needed to be. Now this is 1991, when there was a lot of traffic with Kashmiri boys going across for 3 weeks, 4 weeks of training, and then being sent back. Not an easy trip across 14,000, 15,000 foot mountain ranges. This is downtown Kashmir in 1991 again. The army had cordoned off a neighborhood,
Downtown where?
Srinagar,
Srinagar.
and gone through some houses where they must have had a tip of for weapons. Now, in a cynical way, we would, if you've been through some of these exhibitions before, this could be a traveling weapons show, but this was real. So again, this is the fallout from the Afghan theater, all these AK-47s, RPGs, clips, dynamite, bullets, you name it, it's there, had been smuggled across from Afghanistan to Pakistan, Pakistan to India. Now, this was also downtown Srinagar, where Javed Mir, one of the JKLF leaders, who's still alive, was escorted around the old city. And this would not happen today. And it didn't happen much into the 90s, really. With phone communications, there would have been a paramilitary force on to this in a second. But they were quite brazen in the early days of the 90s with uniforms. Again, not something very normal, but again, from Pakistan's side, training and skill sets to pull this kind of situation off. The Ali Cuddle Bridge in downtown Srinagar, from one part of the city to the old part of the city, the militants had set these alight to block the security forces from coming across. These are wooden bridges, very sad, took all day to go. About 4 o'clock it finally went. It's all pine, wood, really terrible. But these things were happening quite often on visits from Delhi. And remember, it's only an hour's flight from New Delhi. So, in going through some of my Afghan slides recently, we had gone across, a reporter and I, to host Afghanistan. Because now that the camps have been set up in Pakistan, training camps similar to the one that you just saw, they had been moved up to the Afghan theater on the border in NWF being host, and Jalaluddin Haqqani had offered to train, and this is one of the early Al-Qaeda sites. So we had an interview with Haqqani, who said, yes, we do have Kashmiri boys here, and we wondered if we could see and speak to them. He said no. We weren't surprised, but as we were speaking, a group of Kashmiris came through, and you could see the differences in features with the various groups. And they were watching us like hawks, and this slide showed up in my take. They're Arabs, 6 of them, training. And I don't remember how I got this picture, actually, other than luck. So now we go back to Srinagar. That will more or less take you to the routes that Kashmiri militants would cross to Pakistan, be shuttled up to Afghanistan, and then back again. This is a JKLF small procession in the old city. Very doubtful if some of these people are still alive. This is a BSF, Border Security Force, collection of weapons in 1992. AK-47s, because the Indian Army was not using Kalashnikovs then, nor the paramilitary. So these were captured in raids. This is just for the BSF, not for the Army. And all labeled, dates, where they were found. Again, this is not a rent an arsenal. This is real stuff from the Afghan theater. Downtown Srinagar, J&K police picked off. We were having lunch down the street near Lal Chowk, and bang bang noise, run down, and this fellow did not survive, shot at close range, but again witnessed by proximity. And a lot of these trips that I would make to Srinagar were not on assignment. It was busy at that time, and visually you had to try to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Now, this fellow, Saeed Salahuddin, in '92 decided to have a press conference in an apple orchard outside of Srinagar. He's part of the Hizbul Mujahideen, which was not for self-determination, pro-Pakistan. And he's now in Muzaffarabad area on the Azad Kashmir side. He occasionally is brought out for speeches and public appearances, but pretty closely controlled by the Pakistanis.
Is he the same person who was released after the air?
No.
No.
No Kashmiris were released in that kidnapping of the airliner. The hijacking, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. No, he, pretty bold fellow, actually, lucky. Now this is a returned militant in '95, captured, tortured, killed, returned. And this is a normal scene in Srinagar or Sopore, it could be anywhere where this happens. Burn marks, torture marks. This one's more presentable than most that I've come across. And it generally creates quite a stir of passion and emotion. Friends, family obviously gather around, and until he's buried, it's quite a moving scene. This is after a crackdown in 1995 in Srinagar. Rarely do you see fully covered women, but this was one of the more open scenes for us. They sometimes did not allow press to get this close, but a lot of these people could have been kept out for 6-7 hours of their apartments as the paramilitary went through them with a fine-tooth comb looking for weapons or ammunition, grenades, whatever had been given to them as a tip. And you guarantee that no one appreciated this in the middle of winter, much less summer. We go across now. In 1989, they were allowing journalists up to the Siachen Glacier. Pakistan was much more amenable to allowing journalists. This is around 18,000 feet when they were still fighting. There's a ceasefire now along in the glaciers between India and Pakistan. You were often just dropped off, and the helicopters would be heard from the other side, and shelling would begin. This is artillery battles up at 19,000 feet. You had no acclimatization really for us, other than maybe one day at 14,000 feet. And the helicopters would not be able to touch down. You'd pretty much push you out into the snow, take off, and then when you were ready, they'd try to come back up the glaciers to get you. These are French helicopters which fly up to about 22,000 feet. Over back to the Indian side, this is Shamshabari mountain range. Punjab regiment had position right down in the valley, if you can see between the trees. That is Pakistan on the other side, Azad Kashmir. And the camp for the Indian Army in here, and this is the border. They're shelling every night, and the militants cross in this area. This is the Lipa Valley, where they get 15 to 20 feet of snow, and there was just a landslide or an avalanche killing about 17 Indian soldiers this year. So this is in October. It's the end of this resupply that they push through. In November, the passes are closed, so the soldiers are in there for about 5 months. But at night, we did get down to that river bed, and the Pakistanis fire their tracer rounds in one direction, and the militants are shoved across either in the direction of the tracer bullets or in the opposite direction. No light, and this is before night vision ability, so it was really difficult to walk and catch them from the Indian side. They were often caught. Most of them don't. On many runs, most of the cross-border attempts are not successful. But this is again a rare situation for a foreigner to get this close in this location. The Indian Army is very sensitive to allowing foreigners up to their positions. Pakistan again is much more generous. Now we go up to 99 in the Kargil conflict. I had gone across to Pakistan and had befriended Nawaz Sharif earlier, working in Pakistan, and he offered myself and some other journalists to go up with him to, this is Gultari. This is about 12 to 14,000 feet, as I remember. This is behind the lines resupply base, and I had slowly heard about General Musharraf. I'd never laid eyes on him, but this relationship, as you probably know, fell apart quite quickly in '99, and I don't think they're sharing too many words at the moment, but again, this was a battle that Pakistan said had been started by the Kashmiri Mujahideen, and which we suspected was total rubbish. And in fact, after this particular trip, we broke off, a Pakistani journalist and I, and we were able to get up to the line of control. How, I to this day don't know why they gave us permission, but there's a very interesting story here. These are Pakistan Army soldiers. This is a lieutenant in the bottom and a sergeant who was living at this camp called Mumtaz. It's at 10,000 feet. And it's 5 to 6 kilometers from the Srinagar to Leh highway, right here. This little V. And they're waiting for Army convoys, Indian Army convoys, to go by. As some of you may know, are in at least 100 to 150 trucks going up to Leh, and they pass through Kargil. Now, inside this wall of rock is a 57 millimeter cannon. It's very cleverly done. You can barely see it. And these are the shells. They're waiting for the convoy, or they must have had a spotter up ahead. So it's 6 kilometers to that location. They fire. It's inside this cave. The poor guy sits. He's completely deaf. They hit a truck that I watched through the binoculars. And they time it perfectly. They hit the rear of the Tata truck, caught on fire. They stopped so we could watch it from binoculars. And there was no way that Mujahideen would be able to do this. They just did not have the training nor the facilities. So the reporter had gone away down river somewhere and reached the Northern Light Infantry, the NLI, who said, "That's absolute rubbish that jihadis are doing this. It's us. And we're the ones dying, and we're the ones that should be getting the credit." So this was the first real confirmation that there was something behind, Mr. Musharraf's scheme here. And this is a 105 howitzer shooting pretty much straight up and over the range to an Indian position. And this is a 155 piece of millimeter artillery which fired and hit that Indian position about 10 kilometers away from the previous slide. So they did have some accuracy. It's serious terrain, very difficult to hold, but you can imagine in the middle of winter when everyone moves around and this little chessboard takes on a new shape. This is about 3 kilometers from the line of control. Here, this is about 30 miles from Peshawar, in a town called Risalpur. These are jihadi recruitment posters actually hand-painted, for Harakat Mujahideen in Lashkar-e-Toiba. This is a bus stop.
It says fight in the name of God.
And here is a easier to read one. And they're recruiting in Nowshera. This is, I think, where they want people to go, which is a larger town near Peshawar. This is in Atmakam, which is on pretty much the Indian-Pakistan border, the LOC, and the mountains are India. Now this school had been shelled on numerous occasions. That's why we were taken there, to show the damage inflicted by the Indian Army. And who knows, it's not a good thing to shell schools or hospitals, but occasionally it's done. And the kids are holding their classes outside. But look at the border. There's no way to miss if you're aiming downhill. Atmakam is not high on a list of relocating to. And we moved to the year 2000 in March of 2000, when Bill Clinton arrives with Hillary in Delhi. As many of you know, he has a fondness for India, and I quickly got out of the security mess in Delhi and figured something would happen in Kashmir, so I located myself for his visit up there, and wouldn't you know it, they 2 or 3 fellows dressed in Indian Army uniforms in a village about, I don't know, Bashar, maybe 2 hours from Delhi, Chadi Singhpura?
No, just a 1 hour flight.
1 hour drive.
Like
Okay.
2 hours after train.
Right. Lined up, Sikh men. It's walnut orchards, apple, almonds, fruit trees, beautiful terrain, and gunned them down. 36, I believe. I got a call at 5 in the morning. We drove like mad to get up there. It's about 9, 10 in the morning. Horrific scene. The Sikh community is not involved in the militancy. They've been left alone. They're caught in the middle, and this was to put a black mark on Clinton's visit. And it's fairly certain that these were Pakistanis. It's never been 100% confirmed, but the Sikhs definitely said that these boys were speaking with a bad Hindi accent, mostly Urdu. Not an interest. It was really quite horrific, particularly to see a village wiped out like this, non-combatants. This is 2002 in Srinagar. Some militants had taken refuge in a house during elections in September, held the family hostage. They eventually escaped, and I'm not sure if the militants got out, but the BSF typical technique is to either start it on fire or blow it up. And I had snuck into a house behind it and just waited. It was quite comical. BSF aren't the sharpest knives in the drawer, and numerous attempts with car batteries to set their explosions. Really quite comical, but again, destruction of property, quite a waste. This is in Sogam, a little bit closer to the line of control. There was a funeral of a candidate for parliament who'd been assassinated during a campaign, and the chief minister, Abdullah, had shown up. So the militants snuck down into the valley from the mountains and started peppering the area with bullets, created pandemonium, and and then they slipped away, but these fellas, as is usual, round up the usual suspects. Kashmiri boys. I had followed the Indian Army up into the hills on the outer edge of this village, and as they walked past me, you could see the rifle butt marks on their back. It had nothing to do with it, and the real fellas had filtered away up into the forest, which there was no way the Indian Army was going to catch them, but mission accomplished, and Kashmiri people get caught in the crossfire. This was very unusual for access. I just went along with them, ran with them until they threw me out. And soon after the real interrogation started, they did not want me around. Back over to the Pakistan side, on the Azad Kashmir. Again, this is a Siachen trip in 2005. This is the base camp for the Siachen operation on the Pak side in a town called Jiari, 14,000 feet, where every soldier spends about a week to 10 days and then walks up to their higher altitude positions. They were performing some rope exercises and lined up. Really, the winter gear is quite amazing how much each soldier has to wear and spend. You'll see them. This is at 19,000 feet. Costs them thousands and thousands of dollars a day to operate. Now, there is a ceasefire. They're not carrying rifles. There's no guns that are visible. And I think the ceasefire is still holding. But you think you can walk at this altitude without being climatized? It's extremely difficult. One step at a time. And 8 out of 10 injuries come from altitude sickness or related to the altitude. It's a tough existence. This gives you an idea of the small huts that they live in, yurts. It was quite a day for them that visitors would come in. In 2005, I had gone there for a Human Rights Watch examination of destruction on both sides, government and militant. And by coincidence, 2 to 3 militants had shut off Lal Chowk in the afternoon one day, taking up different positions, blocking traffic, completely shutting down the city. And this is about 36 hours later. They were poking holes in the ceiling, dropping grenades in the second floor of a big blocked house and shop area downtown Srinagar. And eventually they cornered the militant. If you look in here, this is what remained of him. They must have kicked in the door and found him, but they were also firing from the street inside. These are the two. Now that is not Kashmiri. I don't know what they found for identification, but it's probably Lashkar-e-Toiba. Brazen move. This family in 2005, during a wedding, a day before, in a village called Bilgam, where the Indian Army has an outpost. An all-night reception was going on, and 2 teenage boys were out in the bushes smoking a cigarette. And one of the guards heard the noise and fired into it, thinking it was militant, and killed them. This is 2008, Republic Day in January 26th. Downtown Srinagar, strike is usually called. And nothing happens. There's sort of a pomp and circumstance. This is the Deputy Chief Minister, Muzaffar Beg, reviewing the soldiers and police. in Bakshi Stadium. Again, we were the only, it's kind of forced for the bureaucrats to show up for this, no one else goes. But again, this is a tradition that could have been in the previous century. In 2008, I visited with a writer to do something on post-traumatic stress in Srinagar. And there are two ways. There's the spiritual way of healing, and there's the clinical way, which takes place at a hospital and clinic. Now, there are certain shrines in Srinagar and throughout Kashmir that people go to for healing, prayer, silence, grieving, meditation, and some of this is the Shah Hamdani, really quite beautiful papier-mâché crafts, and this is how things are passed on from generation to generation. This is the clinical side of the medical system, where people line up to get their prescriptions refilled. As violence goes down, the numbers of nervous breakdowns and anxiety attacks go up, and particularly for women, the burden really falls on them with missing men, killed or no bodies returned, families broken up. Again, back to the shrine, Pir Dasagir Shrine. Certain days it's very crowded. This is inside, really quite impressive workmanship, and left alone, thankfully. In the Sufi tradition. This is outside Shah Hamdani Mosque on a Friday, women's section. The Maktoum Sahib Shrine. These women have lost, the woman lost a son on the left. In the middle, her husband was taken out by the Rashtriya Rifles. And the woman on the right had lost her husband, also taken away in the middle of the night. Never returned. These are the, what's called a desh, where pieces of cloth are tied at a shrine and a wish is made. If the wish is fulfilled, you come back and cut the desh. You can see that a lot of them go unfulfilled. This woman had lost her husband, who was working in an apple orchard outside of Patan. Not involved in the militancy, according to them. Never seen again. This is Aga Sahib, a pier in Sopore, very famous. People go and appeal to him for a look, a touch, any kind of recognition. He has magical powers. The militants have tried to kill him on numerous occasions. He's naked under that blanket. He's a bit of a nut, but people still believe him. This is a pier in Srinagar. The fellow lying down has been suffering from blindness, and he will say some prayers and breathe on him, breathe the prayers from the Quran. This is a form of medical attention that can't be gotten at the hospitals or doctors. This couple, I think we're suffering from mother-in-law issues. Quite unusual to see a couple, but piers are in the traditions of the valley, very busy, particularly due to the conflict, and this could have happened at any point in time, not necessarily from the conflict, but it's stress-related and no doubt affected by the decades of fighting. This woman, Farida Sundarwani, lost her husband in 1992. has been to 10 doctors and 6 peers. She has taken an appointment with a psychiatrist at the SMHS hospital in downtown Srinagar. Arshad Hussain, the psychiatrist, sees about 100 people a day. She gets about 5 minutes, is able to refill her prescription, and is sent on, and really is suffering from a nervous breakdown. 2 kids, kicked out of the house, no money, husband gone. And she had to borrow money for a bus to get there, 6-hour trip. So that is, brings you up to date from my travels in Kashmir in 2008. I think Dr. Faruqui is next, who will present from the other side as Azad Kashmir. But this is 20 years for me working in the Valley. I still don't get it all, but it takes years as an outsider, as a Westerner, and as a journalist to really work with this. It took me so long just to get to the peer side of healing and to see the conditions that these people have to put up with. There's hardly any help for them in the middle of this, and it's really something that is very difficult to explain within the family structure in Kashmir. Depression and anxiety is not handled so openly as in the West, and again the burden falls on the women in particular, with unable to read and write, as in Sindrawani's case, and pretty much begging for the rest of her life for her kids. Anyway, that is, here we are again. Thank you very much.
It's still working. It's not. It's all set, yes.
Thank you very much, Bob. It was a very moving presentation. The images were really searing and powerful. And what I have in my presentation is more interpretation of data rather than actual photography and the evidence that goes with it. Let me just say a couple of words about my background on the subject. So my parents were from India. They migrated in 1948 to Pakistan. And I was born and raised in Karachi, came to the United States in 1974, trained as an economist. And I should also add that a very large number of my family members have served in the Pakistani military. One admiral, one general, several colonels, majors, and what have you. And at one point in my life, I actually thought I would be going down the same path. The highway in the northern areas, which has been constructed by the Pakistani army, known as the Karakoram Highway, which goes through the northern areas, Gilgit and Baltistan, was built by the Pakistani Corps of Engineers, and one of my uncles was the head of the Corps of Engineers. So that's just truth in advertising, so everyone knows. In 1999, as we all know, and I think your graphical picture of the sheriff that Nawaz Sharif brought out, the event that was transformational in the history of Pakistan took place. And I was in California, it hit me very hard that Pakistan was going down this path of self-destruction. Again, trying to do the same formula over and over again that they had tried in 1947-48, and they had tried again in 1965, and now we're trying in 1999. Always saying it's the guerrillas who are doing it, always trying to instigate a rebellion in the Indian Kashmir. So I started writing, and most of what I do as an avocation is political writing. I write in Pakistani papers. I've written in Daily Times, and now I write in Dawn. So since Kargil happened, this has become an obsession with me, if you will. I have not been near that area in a very long time, even though I must say I did my honeymoon in the northern areas. And it was actually the kind of area you could go to and imagine doing a honeymoon in that area. Anybody who has lived in Pakistan has drunk the waters of the river Indus, which have come ultimately from Kashmir. So to that extent, that's as close as I've gotten. I have not been there. The data I have is more analysis and interpretation, building on the kind of analysis you provided in the survey that you presented. But just so you guys know. What I would focus on is the other side of the story, the Azad, Jammu and Kashmir story, or AJK as it is often referred to. And sometimes it is just abbreviated as AK. Now, AK, if you just add 47 to it, is what the whole story is about. Azad Kashmir has moved forward or backward, depending on your point of view, on the basis of the Kalashnikovs. Now, Pakistani administered Kashmir is not just Azad Kashmir. Many people think that that's all there is to the Pakistani Kashmir. That is not the case. Actually, geographically, the bigger area is Gilgit-Baltistan, which till recently was known as the northern areas. So AJK is one of the two areas that were in the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, administered by the Maharaja, the Dogra dynasty and all of that you know. The other area, which is Gilgit-Baltistan, is much bigger, several times bigger in size, but less populated. But keep that in mind. It is the area from which the Karakoram Highway was built. It is the bridge to China from which the army will arrive to save the day should things go not well. That was one of the theories why it was built. There's hardly any trade going on. It is also the area which was designed to be a tourist resort and has now become a terrorist sanctuary. It sort of abuts the other areas. So this is a case where paradise has become hell. Geography. About 5,000 square miles spread out in the shape of an archer's bow. 250 miles long and 10 to 40 miles wide. This bow was designed to shoot the arrows from which the Indian side would get liberated. Didn't quite happen, but that's the story, and we need to know some of the history. It abuts the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. It's sort of like, one end of it, and it's strategically located. At the southeastern end, it contains a huge water reservoir, which is formed by Pakistan's Mangla Dam on the Jhelum River. And that dam has a power output of 1,000 megawatts. Pakistan's total capacity is about 12,000 megawatts. A very large chunk of that comes from Mangla. Of course, there's supposed to be some royalties given, and there is much debate about what is given. Okay, that's a map. Just to show you, this is Azad Kashmir, this area. That's the bow. That's the Valley of Kashmir, that's Ladakh, that's all the Indian areas, Himachal Pradesh, and these are the northern areas. So this is the sliver from which all of that action that you were talking about is taking place, and some of it goes further north and takes place from the northern areas. Quick word on the demographics. This area has 5 million people in it. This is the sliver, the Azad Jammu and Kashmir, versus 12 million in the Indian administered Jammu and Kashmir. Population growing at about 2.5% per year, which is very robust, perhaps a bit too robust for the resources of the region. 9 out of 10 people live in rural areas. The average household size exceeds 7. Very large number. So there's a lot of demographic pressure, if you will, on these scarce economic resources of the region. Now, interestingly enough, the literacy rates are very high in the region. They're actually higher than in Pakistan. And of course, there's a very large expatriate population that lives in the United Kingdom that is originally from the Mirpur area of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, which is the largest populous area. And they have at least one, if not 2 members in the British House of Commons and the House of Lords from this area. So this gets a lot of visibility and play in British politics. As far as the governance goes, there's a unicameral legislature with 49 seats. The Prime Minister is supposed to be the Chief Executive, and the President is elected by the legislature as the titular head of state. Supposed because they're ultimately being appointed and selected elsewhere. The area has its own high court, but it is not allowed to issue its own postage stamps. Postage stamps carry the mark of another country. There are 2 administrative districts and 8 divisions in this area of 5 million people. Okay, a quick pocket history. You're mostly familiar with this. I'll just give you the brief highlights and then we'll turn to the human rights situation. August 1947, right? That's when the partition occurred. August 15th, according to the Indians. August 14th, according to the Pakistanis. They can't agree on what date they were both created. And it could not be the same date, so that's why they had 2 dates. Within 2 months of that, in October, Azad Kashmir was created. Azad, for those of you who might not know, means free. And it was designed to bring freedom to Jammu and Kashmir. It was supposed to liberate them. And that was the sole aim for its creation. It was meant to be free so that it would inspire rebellion in the adjacent occupied state. And because it didn't occur spontaneously, so to catalyze the reaction in a laboratory setting, raiders were interjected, Afridi tribesmen from the frontier province of Pakistan, about 2,000, into the Indian side, prompting the ruler of Jammu and Kashmir, who panicked, to accede to India. He was hesitating, didn't know which way to go. And of course, there are whole books written on what happened and what didn't happen. Obviously, I won't go into that. And then, of course, that gave the British, former British Viceroy, who was now the Governor General of India, and Prime Minister Nehru, the 2 of them conferred, now that they had the instrument of accession, they flew in a brigade level of Indian troops, and those 2,000 raiders who had come in had reached Baramulla and discovered the opportunity for rape and pillage and gotten distracted from their holy war mission, if you will. The brigade came in and the fighting continued for about a year, and then it just petered out and there was a UN-sponsored ceasefire that kicked in January of 1949. At that point, Kashmir froze. The geography and the territory have not moved much since January of 1949. Now that's half a century away, plus 10 years, but that's where it is. So 1/3 of the territory is in Pakistani hands and 2/3 in Indian hands. It was agreed, and actually it was a proposal that came from the Indian side, that a plebiscite would be held to decide the future affiliation of Kashmir, but the condition was that the forces would have to leave the region. All the armed forces would have to leave the region. And because they have never left the region, therefore no plebiscite has been held. This is a perfect catch-22. In March 1949, AJK signed a power-sharing agreement with the government of Pakistan, ceding all authority related to defense, foreign affairs, refugees, and the plebiscite to the Pakistanis. Pakistan created a ministry for Kashmir affairs to look after its newest asset. In 1955, Pakistan declared martial law in some parts of AJK to suppress street violence. It wasn't quite free. It was now a problem that had boomeranged. In, so there is a cure for this disease.
We just have to hit restart.
Restart later.
Bill Gates, right? So in 1957, Pakistan resorted to police action in AJK to call a public meeting that was seeking direct action to liberate the Indian Kashmir and join it with the Pakistani Kashmir and, God forbid, create a unified independent Kashmir. In 1961, President Ayub, a former general, the first coup leader, if you will, became field marshal at one point, carried out indirect elections in AJK through a basic democracies ordinance, which legally only applied to Pakistan, further straining ties with the people of AJK. Subsequently, faced with Islamabad's dominance in their day-to-day affairs, several AJK leaders started a movement for creating a unified Kashmir. Pakistan was very concerned about this. The balance was not going, the balance of power was shifting. Even the Kashmiris didn't want to be liberated. So in August 1965, Pakistan sent 7,000 guerrillas, all Pakistan Army special folks, disguised as guerrillas. They go in, they couldn't speak the language, they were easily captured, and two of them were even put on All India radio, in which they, as somebody put it, the blighters spilled the beans. They just said what was happening. And so there was no revolt, and I was in Pakistan at the time. The official explanation was that the Kashmiris are traitors. They didn't rise up. We tried to help them. So it didn't pan out. And then you have India, very incensed with this liberation movement, attacking Pakistan up and down the border. Okay, in 22 days there was a ceasefire, and in a few years Ayub was gone. You know, usually that's what happens after failed wars. And then another general comes to power. He has other ambitions and causes all of East Pakistan to secede. More than half the country, 55% is gone. They were trying to get in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. They lost more than half of their own country. Because of many reasons, Kashmir was just one factor. There was some action along the ceasefire line in 1971, but it didn't budge much because India by now had a lot of military deployed in Kashmir. So whatever happened in 65 could not be repeated. India had lost a few key towns like Cham and a few others in the 65 war. And so what happened was, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was now the new Prime Minister of Pakistan, and Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India. They met in Shimla, and they came up with an agreement known as the Shimla Agreement, in which the ceasefire line was now given another name. It was called the Line of Control. And the idea was that perhaps over time it would become the international boundary. But the Pakistanis were not ready to concede that point, because their whole point had been that all of Kashmir should be given the plebiscite, and they were hoping it would join the Pakistanis. So politically, no leader has had the courage in Pakistan to step up to the plate and say, you know, this is not working, and it has remained a stalemate for that reason. We saw pictures of the glacier. India seized it in 1984. General Zia was now the ruler in Pakistan, and it was very embarrassing for him to have lost the glacier. It was an issue of manhood, and they tried their best, but they couldn't get it back. The geography was not in their favor. Fast forward 1998, the bombs are exploded, and now they're nuclear powers. And the theory is that once you have two nuclear powers, there will never be any future war. Okay? That theory was shattered in 1999 by General Musharraf, who took on Kargil. And again, it was another last attempt, last-ditch effort to create this separation that didn't come to pass. What was the objective in Kargil? The objective was to cut off the lines of communications that Indian military units had with the glacier in Siachen and get the glacier back. It was not meant to liberate Kashmir anymore, but it didn't work because in a couple of months after suffering a lot of reverses, the Indian military came in, and of course Bill Clinton and Nawaz Sharif met on the 5th of July in Washington and reached an agreement by which the Pakistanis agreed to withdraw their forces. Now, all along they had said these forces were the local folks. Okay, so there was nothing to withdraw. But they were Pakistani army units who were abandoned, and many of the bodies that were eventually found, when autopsies were done, they had glass in their stomach. They had died of starvation. They were abandoned by their own army. That created a lot of resentment within the Pakistani military, who wanted to be recognized for the sacrifices that they had made. And eventually awards were given, gallantry awards, Nishan-e-Haider, which is like the highest military award, was given to Pakistani military units who had fought and died in that war. So the Pakistani army has stopped saying now that that was not our war. They are proud of the war. And of course, General Musharraf was very frustrated with the withdrawal, and as soon as he got the opportunity, he kicked out Nawaz Sharif and became, the ruler. And I think the rest we know. So back to Kashmir. I mentioned all the Pakistani history because it explains how the Kashmir dynamics have evolved, at least from the Pakistani perspective. In 1970, a legislative assembly was created. In 1974, it passed an interim constitution. Pakistan had passed its own constitution in 1973. Unanimously it was passed. It was modeled after the one in Westminster, parliamentary style. And so the one here was a close replica. 3 rounds of elections have taken place for the assembly, but few observers, and I will survey the observers' comments momentarily, recognize them as either free or fair. Is that a surprise? If you look at what's been happening in Pakistan, which is the role model for Azad Kashmir, that is no surprise. If they cannot do it in Pakistan, how are they going to do it in Azad Kashmir? By the way, keep in mind that Azad Jammu and Kashmir is not a part of Pakistan. It is not a province of Pakistan. It is not a separate country either. It is not recognized by the United Nations. So what is it? It's something that's there, but it's not a country. It doesn't have its own postage stamp. But according to Pakistan, it is the role model for the rest. Okay? So it's sort of like a very calculated and carefully balanced and nuanced fiction in terms of independence. But elections have been held. There are 2 parties. There's the Azad Kashmir People's Party and the Muslim Conference. Those are the 2 main parties. In the 1996 elections, AKPP emerged with a majority of the seats after the MC, which had been ruling up to then, boycotted the elections, and there were accusations of fraud. 2001, the MC won the elections, but within weeks, General Musharraf installed his own choice of president, who was a former Major General of the Pakistani Army of Kashmiri origin. In 2006, there were 369 candidates from 15 parties who contested the 41 directly elected seats, of which the MC won a majority. The other seats are assigned on the basis of quotas. Those elections were flawed and greeted with widespread charges of poll rigging by opposition, political parties, and independent analysts. That's a quote from one of the human rights reports. There's a Freedom House report, there's a Human Rights Watch report, and there are a couple of other reports that I have drawn upon, which are listed at the end in references. And I believe these slides will be up on the website at some point. You can consult them. However, unlike the 2001 elections, the polls featured few instances of physical violence and harassment, which had occurred in all prior elections. There were threats, but apparently they were not carried out. And of course, you will remember there was the horrible earthquake in 2005. There was a large international presence of journalists, and they may have conditioned the ability to carry out the same kind of harassment that was previously there. So it's ironic and sad that there is violence from the state, not only on the Indian side, but also on the Pakistani side. The average person living in Azad, Jammu and Kashmir doesn't have much of a choice when it comes to political rights. He either agrees with the state doctrine, which is there will be accession to Pakistan. If he speaks up against it, whether it's a journalist, as a professor, or anyone else, he's going to be harassed and targeted. So there is no middle way. You're either with us or with them. So, as I mentioned, political status of this region is marked by ambiguity. Not an independent state, not a province, not an agency, but it really is being governed by a ministry of Kashmir affairs out of Islamabad. Islamabad has to approve all legislation. That's what I have read everywhere. That's what everyone seems to be saying. How is it actually done? We don't know. There's certain murky sea kinds of situations, and there's a lot that happens that we don't know. But that's what the evidence seems to be pointing to. In addition, the daily administration of the state, including the disbursement of its budget, is handled by that ministry. The Kashmiri Council is supposed to be like a superstructure which has members from the Pakistani side as well as the Azad Kashmiri side, but the Pakistanis are in the majority. And the council is headed by either the president or the prime minister of Pakistan. So that's a lot of circumstantial evidence indicating that it is not an independent state. But ultimately, the power resides in the Pakistani military. I have visited their bases around the border with Kashmir. The GOC, the General Officer Commanding of the 12th Division in Murray, the troops are just ringed all around, and that's where the real power is. That's where the guns are, that's where the howitzers are, and of course, that's the big challenge. And of course, as you all know, the Pakistani military governs not just Azad, Jammu and Kashmir, but also the country of which it is a part. So how would it be any different in that other state? That's the big challenge. The Kashmir command of the Pakistan Army is the largest corps command in the army. The 10th Corps is headquartered at Rawalpindi. Right across is Jammu and Kashmir. The 12th Infantry Division, the 19th Infantry Division, and the 23rd Infantry Division. Those three divisions, plus several brigades, control the war that is happening in Azad, Jammu and Kashmir, and from which it is going into the Indian side. Quick case in point in terms of the liberation or independence of the Kashmiris, Sardar Ibrahim, let me see if I can repeat that. The founder of Azad Jammu and Kashmir was Sardar Ibrahim. He passed away in 2003 at the age of 88. He's 4 times the president of that area. The founder and 4-time president. He favored accession to Pakistan, but got confused along the way, or maybe discovered that this wasn't going to happen. And so, at various times, he proposed a neutral state of Jammu and Kashmir on the Swiss model, for which he earned no amount of irritation, lots of irritation from the Pakistanis. Twice he was dismissed by the Pakistanis. General Ayub once in the second term of Sardar Ibrahim, and in his 3rd term by General Zia. Just flat out fired and told to resign. When he didn't resign, he was brought over in a helicopter to Islamabad and asked to leave. So, that's free Jammu and Kashmir. Okay, the Freedom House has put out a really nice report, and then I'm sure some of you will think I'm heavily biased against a certain situation here, but I'm taking the evidence as presented. And I searched and searched the Azad Jammu and Kashmir website. If you've been there, you know what I mean. It is not functional. I don't know whether that's for a reason or it's just an IT problem, but I've been trying to get on it for a month. It has great menus and scenic views. You click, you get to the subtopics, and there is nothing that appears. Okay? You get on the website and check their newspapers. Their newspapers are unintelligible. I don't know what it is. They need to do a better job at doing their PR. Political rights get a score of 6 on a scale of 1 to 7, where 7 is rock bottom. Okay. Civil rights get a score of 5. So as long as you stay away from political issues, and you're just talking about going to college or school or having a normal job, it's better than trying to speak out against the policy, which is accession to Kashmir. You cannot get a job or be elected if you don't swear allegiance to that oath, that you approve of the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to Pakistan. All of it, not just the Azad. Now, if I was living there and seeing what I have gotten by acceding to Pakistani sovereignty, then I don't know if I would really want it for the rest of it, but that's just the way it is. Now, the Constitution, as I said, forbids individuals and political parties from taking part in activities that are prejudicial to the ideology of the state's accession to Pakistan. Police in recent years have regularly suppressed anti-government demonstrations, sometimes violently, but there were no reports of death or lengthy detentions in 2008, which I'm sure contrasts with the situation in the Indian Kashmir. It's ironic that we're even talking about any of this in the free part of Kashmir. The Human Rights Watch put out an assessment in 2006, much of the same story. Huge problems with the inter-services intelligence, which is the ISI of the Pakistani government, which is deeply penetrating there, which is running the war. You mentioned, I think very importantly, the connection between the Afghan-Soviet war and then the emergence of the Mujahideen as a feared force that had gotten rid of the world's superpower. They were now brought into, and the ISI ran that operation. The ISI is running the operations in Azad Jammu and Kashmir as well. These days they're taking a low profile, but they're still there. extensive surveillance of the pro-independence groups. The worst thing you can do in Azad, Jammu and Kashmir is talk about independence. Arbitrary arrests and detentions are commonplace, and of course there are reports documented in this which I took out because I thought they would be really graphic. I took them out of your pictures. Just imagine similar things happening on the other side. I don't know what it is with human beings, what they are capable of doing to other human beings. Once you get into that room that's locked up with a light in there, I mean, you just don't know what will happen. Whether it's Guantanamo or the prisons in Kashmir, the same scenarios happen. And as far as the military and intelligence services are concerned, they have impunity for acts of torture. No trials have occurred. No charges of excessive violence have been filed. Because it doesn't happen. It's not reported. So how could it happen? There is a lot of struggle that's going on in the northern areas. They didn't have any legislative assembly or rules, so they have struggled, and since Mr. Zardari came to power, they actually have been given a legislative assembly, and there is some work taking place there. They'll probably get to have a similar status as Azad, Jammu and Kashmir at some point. So in June 2009, for the first time, there was a suicide bomber who carried out an attack in Azad, Jammu and Kashmir. Now, I think you alluded to it in your pictures. The Wahhabi strain of Islam is not there in the Kashmiri culture. It's more the Sufi strain. It's very non-violent. It's into mysticism. But obviously with the Mujahideen coming in and the other angles coming in, you're seeing that change a little bit. And this attack that was carried out specifically targeted the military barracks of the Pakistani army, raising questions whether the militants had opened a new front in Kashmir, just as they are being put under pressure by the Pakistani army in the northwest frontier province. They're going after the soft targets, if you will. Nobody claimed responsibility. The suspicion has rested on the Pakistani Taliban, which have been hit very hard by the Pakistani army in the federally administered tribal areas of Fatah, which actually is a misnomer because they are not federally administered. They are almost independent, but that's the euphemism that's used. The other outfit that could be the cause for it is the Lashkar-e-Taiba, which you alluded to, which keeps on changing its names, and now I believe they're called the Jamaat al-Dawa. They are also regarded by many people as being behind the attacks in Mumbai. And so these groups are taking it out, and we will see perhaps more of these take place unless the Pakistani military calls off its onslaught on them. And within the Pakistani military, there are two schools of thought. One school of thought is, this is over. The jihad is over. The holy war is over. This is a different era. The world doesn't like it. The US doesn't like it. Try a peaceful approach. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought says, well, we will do what we need to do through other means. And there is a clash going on within the Pakistani army and in the hierarchy that hasn't quite resolved itself just yet. The long and short of it is that the situation in Azad, Jammu and Kashmir would not be what it is, which is very depressing and sad, except that there's a conflict between India and Pakistan. A long-running conflict going back to 1947. So there's a lot of books out there on that subject, lots of articles and what have you. The distillation of it is, depending on which scholar you subscribe to, you will argue that the Kashmir dispute is about territory and water resources. There's some intrinsic value in that region, even though only 17 million people live there, out of the 1.3 billion people in the South Asian subcontinent. And what a small ratio, but it's those water resources, or it's the territory. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is, no, it's about ideology. And it's a question of India wanting to say we have a Muslim majority state in the Indian Republic, and therefore we are a secular country. And the Pakistanis saying, no, partition was all about division on religious lines. Kashmir was never given the opportunity to join Pakistan. It is a Muslim majority region, and should be given that option. So that's the ideological conflict. So we don't know what is cause and effect. You know, we have 62 years of analytical failure to figure out what it is. Okay? And so some people just step aside from that and say, well, we don't know what caused it, but the reality is there. We don't know how we got the flu, whether it was the neighbor next door or the person on the mass transit, but we got it somehow. So the question now is, how can we get rid of this flu? Well, that's where this discussion comes in, and I believe you heard President Obama refer to it in his original Afghan-Pakistan policy speech, where he said that the problem of terrorism is not just a problem between Afghanistan and Pakistan, it also involves India because all the roads come from Kashmir. Okay? A controversial statement, but he made it. Okay? And to a large extent, there are many Pakistanis who agree with that statement. Actually, just about all of them probably agree with that statement. That unless that problem is resolved, the Kashmir situation will not settle down. So what's the dispute about? Well, India wants to discuss all issues with Pakistan besides Kashmir. They have talked a lot. Lots of talking, lots of papers, even some non-papers. For those of you who are familiar with the term, non-papers is a diplomatic term for a paper that can never be written down. So it can never be cited. It didn't exist, but it did exist. It was an idea. Okay? And I'll get to that in a moment. But the reality is the Mumbai disaster and the Indian person, both of these, by the way, were ambassadors in Beijing. And so they have known each other, they have some trust, some personal dynamics, if you will, that are favorable. But before the talks even get away, the Indian, I think her name is Rao, the last name, Ms. Rao, she spoke in London at the International Institute of Strategic Studies yesterday and said that we will only talk about the core issue of terrorism. And of course the Pakistanis say the core issue is Kashmir. We'll only talk about Kashmir. And talk about, as somebody put it, and I think I can say it, there are two bald men fighting over a comb. Where is this going to go? So what you have is India seeks a bilateral solution. Pakistan has long sought a multilateral solution until General Musharraf arrived on the scene. You know, much as he created problems, and much as I disagree with most of what he did, I think there was one good thing he did. And here is the guy who attacked Kargil. But just like Nixon went to China and made peace, so Musharraf was in a very powerful position to bury the hatchet. And I'll get to that in a moment. But what he did do was he realized that the multilateral solution was dead. The UN Secretary General a few years back was Kofi Annan. He toured Pakistan, and everywhere he went, he was mobbed and asked to get those UN resolutions implemented that called for a plebiscite. He said they are not binding. They're not part of something called Section 7, whatever that is. And so paper they're written on, right? They were just for celebration. So that was a big disappointment to the Pakistani high command and the military and everyone else. Musharraf was convinced the only approach possible is a bilateral approach. And I believe Pakistan has come around to that position now. If you read this classic book...
Sorry, we are 10 minutes away from actually closing down the session.
Okay, let me just let me wrap up quickly. So the back channel is what Musharraf created. This is narrated at great length by Steve Cole in an article he wrote for the New Yorker. And what he did was, in the back channel, this was going to be the solution. That's the bottom line, that Kashmir would become an autonomous region in which Kashmiris would move freely across the line of control and conduct trade. And over time, peace would come to the region and the militaries would withdraw, and then the LOC would become the border. Okay. That was the crux of it. I'm going to skip this, but just look at this, that Musharraf concluded and convinced the corps commanders that there was a need for a paradigm shift. And just look at this. He said to the corps commanders, we cannot get Kashmir by force. If you think you can, speak up. Nobody spoke up. Okay. So, ultimately the question became, the army needs to grow for whatever reason. Can the economy support it? That became the focus. They said we have to have trade with India in order to get the economy going, and then we can get the army going. The Indian leadership also saw an opportunity, and I'm going to skip this because I think some of you are probably familiar with it. The Mumbai attacks arrived, and India had, of course, an opportunity to carry out attacks on the Pakistani side against the camps. Many people were calling for attacks. The hotheads in New Delhi were calling for attacks. It didn't occur because I think many senior members of the Indian leadership are now convinced that those attacks will just unite the Pakistanis behind the terrorists and create a more difficult position. So it has to be through negotiations that a solution has to be found. So we are back now to square one. The Zardari government's foreign minister just last week said that there is no record of Musharraf's back channel. It was never written down. It didn't exist. So we're starting from square one. And I guess we will see what happens. So what about the future? Well, my prediction is, such as it is, that in the near term, nothing will change. The slugfest will continue. You'll have this great dialogue, and they will talk past each other like they have talked past each other for 62 years. For the long haul, the quality of life will probably worsen along both sides of the line of control. And it could worsen significantly if Pakistan and India just have some other crisis that kicks in. I mean, it's still as explosive as tinder can be. Now, if Pakistan has a sea change, it's a big if, and calls off the jihad and seeks a peaceful solution, then we can see progress happening. But that cannot happen unless India makes some concessions, because no Pakistani leadership is going to survive by making a unilateral gesture. So there have to be some substantial concessions from the Indian side, and the accusatory stance and temper that New Delhi often shows to Islamabad has to go in hiding. Thank you, and I'll stop at that.
We actually don't have too much time left here for discussion, and all of you have been very patient, but I think it's very important that we listen to Parvez Imroz's 10-minute statement for Srinagar for all kinds of reasons that I'm happy to unravel later. As those of you who, several of you will have heard his name, he is perhaps Srinagar's most significant human rights and civil rights campaigner. He heads, along with a few other collaborators, the Jammu and Kashmir Coalition of Civil Societies. And as is usually the case with people like him, he has applied, let's put it very, in the most banal fashion, he has difficulties getting passports, and his movements are curtailed. Right now, I believe the legal situation is he has applied for his passport, has been asked to reapply, it has been granted to him. He is one of the authors of this report called Buried Evidence, which is about human rights abuses. There are a few extra copies here. These are extra, right?
Right.
For any of you who are interested, please do pick one up at the end of the session.
He has refused the travel documents to me. Since my colleague Ahmad Faruqui has briefed you about the report, Buried Evidence, which has been prepared by the International People's Tribunal on Kashmir, I'll be mentioning about the other issues. We have initiated the Coalition of Civil Society 10 years before. It is an initiative of different organizations, voluntary initiatives, working on different disciplines, mostly on the human rights. The basic objectives to strengthen the civil society, to evolve a vibrant civil society in this conflict area, Jammu and Kashmir. Because we believe that for protecting the democracy, for preserving peace, for ensuring the civil rights, and also for the non-violent conflict resolution of the Kashmir and globally, a vibrant civil society is very important. Because the human rights or civil rights are only the issue before the politicians once they are not in the power. We believe that we have to evolve the institutions in Kashmir. Even after the conflict resolution of the Kashmir, these institutions can only protect the democracy and civil rights. As you know, in the democracies, where there is a contract between the people and the authorities, the civil society is a medium between the people and the government. But in the suppression and oppression, the role of the civil society is to give resistance, to expose the lies of the state, to speak truth, to show grace under pressure. We are in this process, and we are very happy that we have succeeded to evolve that culture of civil society in this conflict area. And we are also conscious that how important it is for us to build the alliances with the global civil society. And we have succeeded partly in that process. Because we understand that in the era of globalization, the globalization is not only the globalization of the economy, but also the globalization of responsibility. And we are in a process to do that. Particularly when the Indian state, when the Indian corporate media, and also the Indian civil society are not expressing their concern or not admitting the facts about the Kashmir. The Jammu and Kashmir is the highest militarized zone in the world. More than 700,000 security forces are in Jammu and Kashmir to neutralize the militancy here. And the state force, which was 35,000 before 1989, is the police personnel here in the JMK state. I mean, double now. We have 81,000 police force, and now also they think of doubling that also. They are targeting that more than 1.50 police personnel, the police force in this country. And besides that, there are also the village defense committees. There are also the special police officials. There's a huge recruitment of the military and police apparatus in the state of Jammu. And it's not only the presence of the army, paramilitary, police personnel and other non-state actors, but the way the powers have been given to them. The draconian legislations like Armed Forces Special Powers Act, where they have the powers to arrest, to kill anybody with impunity. They have the legal impunity, which is the biggest issue here. They can't be prosecuted unless the federal government doesn't give the sanction. 458 cases, which in one of the cases which I am dealing, that the state of Jammu and Kashmir has sent to the federal government for sanction, and the sanction is evaded. These are the cases where the investigation has been conducted by the local police investigating agencies, and they have found there is enough evidence for prosecuting of these army personnel, and the federal government doesn't give them the sanctions. So there are hundreds and hundreds of cases where there is no prosecution, and the government has been claiming that they have punished the perpetrators, they have punished the army officials, but which has never been made public. And whether the punishment is really proportionate to the crime, we can't punish an army official committing rape or killing a teenager just by suspending him, which is not a punishment, or just reducing him the rank, or by transferring from one post to another post. So militarization is a huge issue. Militarization in Jammu and Kashmir is that you have the camps everywhere. You have, and camps mean that you have the torture chambers there, where the local people are being tortured. A torture which is a huge issue, according to the people, according to the workers, to work on the torture things. So militarization in the Kashmir has affected every sphere of life, even the wildlife, by fencing of the army, the flora and fauna, the saplings which have been taken by the army, the deforestation in the Kashmir, the glaciers, the environmental, the imbalance which is causing by the huge presence of the army there. And the most unfortunate thing is the way the army's functioning here has never become an issue for Indian civil society. I'm not talking about the legal impunity. I'm also talking about the moral impunity they are getting, the political impunity by politicians they are getting by saying they are doing a patriotic duty in Kashmir. That means by killing the non-combatants in Kashmir, disappearing hundreds and thousands of people. More than 8,000 people have been disappeared, even admitted by the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Sometimes 3931 people are missing, or sometimes saying 3,744 people are missing. And when the report was released, buried evidence, the state government was given the copy and they have no reply. I am just referring here about the moral impunity which they are deriving from the Indian civil society, from the corporate media, and also the judicial impunity they are getting from the courts. Because it is the perception is that the Indian courts are very powerful institutions in India. It is true. As for the India is concerned, as for Jammu and Kashmir, it has become a part of the colonial judicial system. And sometimes I believe also the judges, the honorable judges here are also the part and parcel of the excesses by their inaction, by not exercising the powers they have to minimize them, if not stop them. Even in war, there are limits that how the combatants should behave and how the wars are conducted. And under the flag of democracy, you can't do the undemocratic things here. That's why that we, the civil society group, who are doing what we believe is very important for us, because we believe that every generation is accountable to another generation. We believe that our silence will be criminal. It's cowardice. It will be for our silence that our future generation will have to pay for that. That's why we are speaking. But we can't do it alone. Unless the civil society groups, once we are talking about the civil society, means the civil society, value-based civil society groups outside cannot extend support to us, cannot extend a moral support to us, particularly. Because once there is a concern from the global civil society, particularly from the academicians, that really can make a lot of difference. That will really question the Indian state before the international community that what she is doing in Kashmir or elsewhere, or any government doing any atrocities, and that too the governments which are regulated with being the largest democracy, it really can seek moral accountability from them, and that definitely can make a difference. We believe that it is very important for us to get support from the different civil society groups outside. And on our part, what we are doing here, we will continue doing with it. And at the end, I will quote the saying of E. Wissel, the Nobel laureate, quote, "Neutrality helps nobody, it helps the oppressor. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere when human lives lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy. The national borders becomes irrelevant when people are persecuted because of their color, caste, creed, or political conviction. And at that time, that place becomes the center of universe. Unquote. I really expect that what was happening in Kashmir should be debated and discussed, and the government of India should at least feel that she is accountable before the international community. Dear friends, in 2003 I had an opportunity to visit the Howard